A Patriots Faith, Chapter 10. Paul Connor instinctively opened his eyes at 0500, a habit he had been unable to break since his time in the Army. Across from his bunk, sitting at a table, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette, was Bryce Leonard. "Morning, sunshine. You all decided to sleep in this morning, I see," quipped the big man. Paul looked at his watch, which was sitting on the stool beside his cot, confirming that he indeed had not overslept. "As soon as the princess over there wakes up, we can go get some chow. I hope it ain't going to be much longer. I'm starving." Bryce smiled as he crushed out his cigarette. Carson Lee, hearing the big man's booming voice, woke up himself. He rubbed his eyes, checked his watch as well. "Morning, sunshine," he said to Carson. "Oh, excuse me, I suppose that's Senator Sunshine to you," he chuckled. Carson swung his feet over the bunk and said, "We'll see about that, Moose. How long you been up?" Bryce smiled again and answered, 0300. Already been for my morning walk. I do 5 miles every morning. Keeping in shape just keeps getting harder every year, so I keep starting earlier. Keeps me from getting too soft. But I suppose you boys is too young to know anything about that." He chuckled again and said, "Your day's coming, make no mistake." He stood up and holstered his .45, which he'd been cleaning at the table. "If y'all are up to it, maybe we can go eat now. I'm starving." Suddenly, 3 helicopters roared overhead in quick succession. The walls of the cabin shook. The dinnerware rattled on the open shelves. Bryce Leonard looked up and exclaimed, "Looks like our morning guest is early. That's just great. I knew I should have eaten when I finished my walk." He looked over at Carson and Paul. "Get dressed and be in the mess tent in 3 minutes." He walked quickly out the cabin door and headed for the helicopter landing pad on top of the knoll at the far end of camp. The helipad was just big enough for 1 helicopter to land. The other 2 hovered overhead as 3 men got off the copter on the ground. It immediately lifted back off, and the 3 helos were gone as quickly as they came. 2 of the men that landed wore black fatigues, carried AR-15s. They walked in front of the 3rd man. He wore a pair of faded blue jeans and a canvas Carhartt vest. He had an expensive pair of tactical boots and a fleece coat under the vest. They made their way to the mess tent. When they arrived, Carson and Paul were already seated at the table drinking coffee. Bryce led the 3 men in. The 2 armed men stood at the door at attention as the 3rd man passed by. He turned and told the other 2, "At ease, men. Grab a cup of coffee and some chow. We lift back off in 1 hour." The 2 men simply nodded and said in unison, "Yes, sir." The 3rd man walked over toward the table with Bryce. "Carson Lee, fancy running into you out here," the man said with a cheery disposition. Carson turned to see his friend and senatorial mentor, Conrad Laramie. "Connie," Carson said, surprised to see his friend. He stood up and extended his hand. "Senator Laramie," he said, as the 2 embraced. "Retired," was all Conrad Laramie said in response. They both chuckled. Conrad greeted Paul as well, and the 4 men sat back down at the table. The men exchanged pleasantries, and then it was right down to business. "Carson, Ken Fowler asked me to meet with you out here. I know he's been pushing hard to recruit you." He looked over at Paul. "Both of you. I also know you got to make a decision pretty quick here. Carson, this position we have for you in this coalition is a pretty important one, not only because of your Senate seat, but also because of your background. And yours too, Paul. We need the both of you, and we know your commitment to this nation and to each other. He paused briefly. Listen, you can still decline. He paused again, a little longer this time. But we're all hoping you won't. The position you'll be filling is the one that I am vacating currently. You heard from Ken about the losses we suffered in the Pacific Northwest last week. I'm taking a position in the organization that will be in charge of overseeing ops in that region. When I retired from the Senate, it was to assume a command role within this organization. Now, that role is being offered to you. Normally, you would be groomed for several years before being given this opportunity. But things being what they are politically, and within our current manpower crisis, we need you here now. I will be in your chain of command as your direct uplink. This is going to keep you both quite busy. Paul, you'll be handling the day-to-day senatorial responsibilities going forward. Carson will be the face of that seat. But Paul, for all intent purposes, you will be the senator from Alaska. That will present some challenges because the media and the chamber appearances still have to be done by Carson. The two of you will be joined at the hip and will be required to travel pretty extensively. I wish I could give you all the nuances of how that will work, but truth be told, we're still figuring it out ourselves. Conrad Laramie sat back and heaved a heavy sigh. He took a long pull on the coffee in front of him. Boys, with the elections just around the corner and all the unrest across the nation, things are happening fast and on multiple fronts simultaneously. We are scrambling to process it all in real time. Our cities are burning. The left and the right are separated to extremes never before seen. To say that the political situation is volatile is a gross understatement. We are on the brink of a civil war. This time it won't be North versus South. It'll be urban versus rural. It'll be a war of ideologies. For decades, the left has been amassing in the inner cities. They have been indoctrinating our youth in the public schools and universities. The extreme right, while mostly silent, have had the just leave us alone mentality, which has worked to generally keep the peace. But it's starting to break down. It's starting to not work anymore. They're reaching a breaking point that when it comes, will come hard, without relent, and it will come quickly. Paul and Carson listened intently. Paul said, "This has been coming for some time, sir." "Well, why do you think it's getting to the breaking point now, as opposed to any other time in our troubled history? It seems like a pretty slow burn, really." Conrad Laramie rubbed his temples. "Gentlemen, there are some pieces of information that are classified. What we are seeing now, most people can't even imagine in their wildest dreams." He paused again as he looked at Carson and at Paul. Then he looked over at Bryce, who simply nodded to him in the affirmative, as if giving him his blessing to go forward. Conrad said, "I'm going to share something with you, boys. It has to stay with us. Is that clear?" Both Carson and Paul nodded. 2 days ago, an operative of ours uncovered a shipment of heavy hardware en route to an Antifa group in Washington State. It was being transported by armed guards, members of the BLM movement. Our man was able to get off a series of pictures to his direct uplink in the command chain before he went missing. This wasn't a van loaded with AR-15s, boys, although that in itself would be bad enough. This shipment was exponentially larger. We suspected that there have been similar shipments elsewhere recently, but this is the only one that we were able to confirm unequivocally. When Pastor Scanlon invited you boys to that first group meeting, he began a process of recruitment that would normally take months or even years to progress to this point right here today. It would have been months before you would normally have met Ken Fowler. But because of the state of things, you have been fast-tracked to a rate unprecedented in our group's history. Now, that scares some of the leadership. Heck, it scares all of us a little, myself included. Pastor Scanlon went out on a very long and narrow limb vouching for you boys. I joined him out there myself recently, and it's starting to crack. He managed a slight smile. He looked Carson dead in the eye. I have to know where you boys fall in this thing, and I have to know now. Ken said he would contact you tonight, but you need to tell me now. He looked at Paul and then back at Carson. If you want to walk away, this is your last chance. You'll never receive the call from Ken if that is your choice. You will never hear from this group again. He let out another heavy sigh and said, If that is what you decide, we have to know we can count on you never speaking a word to anyone about this group. And I know, to some degree, it's already too late to put that genie back in her bottle. That's actually what scares the leadership the most. I don't want to have to tell you what happens if you violate that trust. He looked at both men in a way that he knew they would understand exactly what he was telling them. They were silent. Paul nodded. Carson answered, Connie, I think you know me well enough to know that's not a question. Conrad nodded affirmatively. Yes, son. If I didn't, we wouldn't be at this point. He looked at his watch. He looked at Bryce and back over to Carson and Paul. I'm sorry, boys. I need your answer now. Carson sat back and rubbed his 2-day-old beard. He stared at Conrad Laramie. Paul Connor said, I'm in. Besides, after what you've already told us, how in the world could I close my eyes and ever expect to get a good night's sleep again, not knowing what's happening? I took an oath when I joined the Army, and another one when I became a Ranger. He looked over at Carson. And I swore loyalty to certain individuals, principles, and ideals. And I intend to continue to honor those commitments, wherever that takes us. Whatever it means for me personally. Carson nodded. I'm good to go too. He looked over at his friend. For pretty much all the same reasons, he answered. Outstanding, was all Conrad Laramie said. He stood, shook hands with all three, and walked out of the mess tent, followed by his security detail. Bryce said, Okay, let's eat. Then he looked sternly at the 2 men seated with him. You boys are just about at the point of no return. If you ever think you'll have a change of heart, you better have it before you get that call from Ken Fowler tonight. After that, there truly is no turning back. Carson Lee put his arm affectionately on Bryce's shoulder. Aw, shucks, Moose. You ain't getting rid of us that easily. Paul said, Let's eat. The 3 men got up and into the chow line.